The frozen shadows. It was late December when Sarah found herself stranded in the small mountain town of Glenwood. A blizzard had swept through the region, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that closed off the only road leading back to the city. The weather was getting worse, and the few locals who remained in town had long since retreated indoors. Sarah had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of the town to escape from the chaos of city life, but she didn't anticipate being stuck for this long. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and with no way to get back to civilization, Sarah decided to stay inside her cabin and wait out the storm. The wind howled, rattling the windows as the snowstorm intensified outside. As night fell, an eerie silence descended upon the town. The only sound she could hear was the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. After settling in for the night, Sarah tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. The snowstorm outside created a swirling vortex of white, and at times, it was hard to distinguish the swirling flakes from the shadows outside. Suddenly, Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She thought she had seen a figure in the distance, standing motionless in the snow. Her heart raced. "It must be the wind playing tricks on me," she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, almost too still, as if it were waiting for something. Her curiosity overtook her fear. She grabbed her jacket and opened the door to step outside. The cold air hit her like a wall, and the snow instantly began to bite at her exposed skin. She squinted through the storm, but the figure was gone. She stepped forward, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, looking for any trace of movement. Then, she heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the roar of the wind, but it was there. It came from behind her. "Sarah." She froze, her breath visible in the icy air. Her name. There was no one else around. The thought of running back into the cabin crossed her mind, but something deep inside her, compelled her to turn around. Standing just a few feet away from her in the swirling storm was a figure. But this time, it wasn't still. It was moving, gliding toward her. Its form was cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't walk. No, it glided, like a shadow on the snow. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward. Who are you?" Sarah called out. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it continued to move closer, its body almost dissolving into the wind. With every step it took, Sarah's fear grew. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, her mind unable to process the surreal terror unfolding before her. The figure reached out, its gloved hand brushing her cheek, cold as death itself. Then, it whispered again, closer this time, as if it were right next to her ear. "Come with me." The next thing Sarah knew, she was standing in front of the cabin, her breath coming out in rapid, shallow gasps. The wind had died down, and the snow had stopped falling. It was dead quiet. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if time had rewound itself. But then, she looked up. The figure was gone. Her heart continued to race, and a knot formed in her stomach. She entered the cabin, locking the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. The whispers hadn't stopped, though. They echoed in her mind, growing louder, more insistent. "Come with me." She rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. The storm was gone, but outside, standing in the snow, just beyond the threshold, was the figure once again. This time, it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, waiting. And it wasn't alone. All around the figure, in the shadows cast by the cabin, Sarah could see more forms. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all standing still, their faces hidden by dark hoods. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and they stared at her, silently. A deep dread settled in Sarah's chest. She realized then, the snowstorm hadn't just trapped her in the cabin. It had trapped her in the past. She had crossed a line between the living and the dead, and she wasn't alone anymore. The last thing Sarah heard before everything went black was the whisper, now, all around her. "Come with us." The next morning, the sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a cold, pale light over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, but the silence remained. Sarah had not slept. Her mind replayed the strange, chilling events over and over again. She tried to dismiss it as a nightmare brought on by fear and exhaustion, but deep down, she knew better. The feeling in her gut, that sinking, suffocating feeling, told her that something far darker was at play. She decided to leave the cabin. There was no way she was going to spend another night in that place. She packed her things quickly, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes and essentials into her bag. The thought of heading into the unknown seemed far safer than remaining in that cabin, surrounded by the whispers and the figures that haunted her mind. Sarah opened the door, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The snow was deep, covering everything in a blanket of white. The world looked peaceful, almost serene. But there was something wrong, something off about it. The footprints from the night before were still there, but they weren't just her own. They seemed to be following her. Each step she took, she noticed the snow seemed to shift around her, like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. She glanced back, but there was no one. No figures, no shadows, just the endless stretch of snowy plains. As she walked, her breath visible in the cold, she noticed something strange. The trees. The tall, dark pines lining the path were bent unnaturally, leaning toward her, as if they were watching her every move. Her heart pounded. She had to keep moving. But something in the distance caught her eye. It was faint at first, just a flicker. A shadow, perhaps. But as she squinted against the wind, it grew clearer. It was a figure standing in the distance by an old, decaying cabin further down the path. The same figure from last night. Its form was hazy, like a mirage, but Sarah could make out its long, flowing cloak, the same dark, empty hood. And it was standing still, waiting. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She turned away, ready to run back to the cabin, but her legs froze. She couldn't move. It was as if the snow had wrapped itself around her, chaining her to the ground. The whispers returned, louder this time. "You can't leave." She looked back at the figure. It wasn't just one figure now. There were others. More figures, scattered in the distance, silent, watching, waiting. Their eyes glowed faintly, flickering like distant stars in the dark. Terror gripped Sarah's chest. She had to get away. She had to. "Sarah." The voice came again, clear as day. This time, it was not a whisper. It was a command. Her heart raced as she turned around to face the figure, her legs trembling beneath her. But the figure wasn't alone anymore. It was surrounded by the others, all standing in a circle, their heads tilted slightly as if observing her every move. The cold air thickened, the snow swirling around them in a violent whirl. The storm was back. "Come with us," the figure spoke again, its voice now an eerie, hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The snow turned to ice, creeping up her legs, wrapping around her like chains. Suddenly, a thought pierced through the fog of fear. She remembered the legend, the one the locals had whispered about, the one she had dismissed as superstition. The tale of the spirits trapped in the snow, bound to the land forever, waiting for someone to take their place. The cold that never truly left, the souls who sought to replace their own. And now, it was her turn. Her breathing became shallow, her head spinning. The circle of figures closed in, their eyes glowing brighter, their faces hidden but their intentions clear. With a final, desperate breath, Sarah broke free from the frozen grip of the snow. She bolted, running through the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, the cold never left. It followed her, always just a step behind. In the distance, the figure watched, unmoving, as Sarah disappeared into the storm. But as the wind howled and the snow began to fall again, a strange stillness settled over the land. The footprints in the snow, they were gone, and all that remained was the whispering wind, carrying the cold, endless voices of the lost souls. Sarah ran for what felt like hours, her legs numb from the biting cold, her lungs aching as she fought against the thick, relentless snow. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer as though trying to swallow her whole. The shadows among the branches flickered, just out of her vision, making it feel as if the figures were still there, just behind her, chasing her down. With every frantic step, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though they were right beside her, calling her name over and over again. Sarah, Sarah, come back. She couldn't escape them. No matter how fast she ran, the chill never left. It wrapped itself around her like a suffocating blanket. Her thoughts were clouded, every step feeling like it was dragging her back toward that horrible place. Then, through the haze of panic and snow, she saw a dim light ahead. Her heart leapt. A cabin, maybe, just maybe, someone was inside. She could find safety there, she told herself. She could escape. Without thinking, she bolted toward the cabin, desperate, ignoring the exhaustion clawing at her body. As she reached the front door, she pounded on it, hoping for some sign of life. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. The door creaked open slowly. A thin, elderly man stood in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. He had the same hollow, tired look that the few remaining locals in the town had, the ones who never seemed to leave, never seemed to age. "You shouldn't be out there," he said, his voice raspy yet gentle. "It's not safe." I don't know what's happening," Sarah gasped, her breath freezing in the air. There's someone out there, watching me. They want me. They're following me." The man raised an eyebrow, a faint, knowing glint in his eyes. "I see. Come inside. You've wandered too far." Without hesitation, Sarah stepped inside, relief flooding her as the warmth of the cabin washed over her. The man closed the door behind her, locking it securely, and motioned for her to sit by the fire. "I don't understand," Sarah said, still trembling. I thought it was just a bad dream, but the snow, the figures, they're real, aren't they?" The elderly man sighed heavily, sitting down across from her. He studied her for a moment before speaking, his voice low and slow. "You've crossed into something beyond our world," he explained. "This town, it's not just a town, it's cursed. It's been trapped in time, in a loop ever since the storm began. The people who live here, or should I say, the ones who stayed, are not like you and me anymore. They're bound to the land, trapped by the snow. And those figures you see, those shadows in the storm, they're not just ghosts, they're part of the curse." Sarah's heart began to race again. "What do you mean? What do they want from me?" "They want you to take their place," the man continued. "They want you to stay forever. They'll keep you here, keep you in the storm, keep you in this loop. It's been like this for decades. Everyone who comes, everyone who stays too long, becomes part of the land. They either leave or they join them. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. But I can't leave. The storm, the snow, it's impossible to escape. The man nodded solemnly. That's right. You've been marked. Once they find you, once you see them, you're bound to the storm, to the land. There's only one way out. Sarah's pulse quickened. What's that? Break the cycle. Find the source of the curse, the man said, his voice growing quieter. The heart of the storm. If you can destroy it, if you can sever the connection between the spirits and the land, the curse will be lifted. You'll be free. But there's no telling if you'll make it back. The storm, it will fight you. It will try to keep you. And if you fail, you will join them. You will be one of them. Sarah stared at the man, her mind spinning. She didn't want to die in this cursed town. She couldn't. But how could she even begin to fight something so powerful, something so ancient? She looked out the window at the swirling white snow. The figures were still out there, she knew it. Watching, waiting. A heavy silence hung in the air. Then the man spoke again, his voice filled with an unsettling finality. It's up to you now. The storm has already chosen you. Sarah swallowed hard, her resolve hardening. She couldn't just stay here. She had to do something. She had to try. With determination, she stood up, her hands shaking but her mind clear. The storm would not claim her. She would find the source. She would break the curse. As she opened the door to leave, the man spoke once more. Remember, if you fail, you will become one of them. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the swirling blizzard. The cold bit into her skin, but she pressed on. She would find the source. She would end the curse, and she would survive. The storm howled as Sarah disappeared into the swirling white chaos. The figures from her nightmares still watching from the shadows, waiting for her to make her final choice. Would she find the heart of the storm? Or would she become another soul lost to the snow forever? The wind howled, fierce and unforgiving, as Sarah trudged deeper into the blizzard. The snowflakes whipped around her, biting at her skin like 1,000 tiny daggers. She barely noticed the cold now. All she could focus on was the singular goal that burned in her mind: breaking the curse, finding the heart of the storm. It was her only hope for survival. Every step she took seemed to sink her deeper into the snow, making it harder to move forward. The weight of the storm pressed against her, like invisible hands pushing her back, urging her to turn around. The air felt thick with a presence she couldn't see but could feel creeping just beyond her vision. The figures. She knew they were out there, following her, watching her. But no matter how much she looked over her shoulder, she couldn't spot them. They were patient. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. She stumbled over a fallen tree branch and landed face first in the snow, the cold seeping into her skin. She pushed herself up, wiping the snow from her face, and forced her legs to keep moving. Each step felt like it drained a piece of her strength, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach the heart of the storm. The woods around her seemed to stretch on forever. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization, only the endless expanse of snow and ice. The storm made it impossible to see beyond a few feet in front of her, but she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back now. Minutes turned into hours. The snow kept falling and the wind kept howling. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps, her throat raw from the cold. Her fingers were numb and her legs felt like lead. She wanted to collapse, to give in to the exhaustion, but she couldn't. She knew what would happen if she did. The figures would close in, their cold hands reaching for her, pulling her into the storm forever. Suddenly she noticed something in the distance, a dim light flickering through the storm. She squinted, her eyes struggling to focus. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it was something. Maybe it was the source. She forced herself to move faster, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the light, she realized it was coming from an old cabin, much like the one she had just left. The door was slightly ajar, and the warm light inside beckoned her like a lifeline. She hesitated for a moment, a sense of unease washing over her. She had already been warned by the elderly man. This could be a trap, but she had no choice. The storm was relentless, and she couldn't go on much longer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warmth hitting her like a wave. It was a small, rustic cabin, much like the one from before, but this one was different. It felt wrong. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood as if by something or someone desperate. The air was thick with a musty, foul smell that made Sarah's stomach turn. The light she had seen was coming from an old lantern in the corner of the room, flickering dimly. But it wasn't the lantern that caught her attention. At the center of the room was an altar. The wooden table was covered in strange markings, surrounded by items that looked ancient: bones, dried herbs, and what appeared to be a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The symbols on the walls were everywhere, covering every inch of the space, and Sarah could feel their weight pressing down on her. She stepped closer to the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the presence again, stronger now. The figures were watching her. She could hear their whispers, faint but persistent. Sarah. She reached for the journal, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with notes, but they weren't written in any language she recognized. The symbols were similar to the ones on the walls, but there was one word she could make out. Heart. Her breath caught in her throat. Could this be the key? Was this the heart of the storm? Without thinking, she grabbed the journal, clutching it tightly to her chest. The room began to grow colder, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The figures outside were drawing closer, their cold eyes locked onto her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, the light from the lantern flickering wildly as if reacting to something unseen. Sarah's pulse raced. She wasn't alone in the cabin anymore. The figure she had seen in the snow was standing in the corner of the room, its form cloaked in darkness. Its hood was pulled low, hiding its face, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her. Its presence was suffocating. "Leave," the figure hissed, its voice cold and hollow, sending a chill through her very bones. "You cannot escape. You are one of us now." Sarah's grip tightened around the journal, the weight of its significance heavy in her hands. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she opened the journal to the page with the strange symbols. And as she did, a surge of energy filled the room. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing with an eerie light. The figure advanced, its form flickering in and out of focus, as if it were being pulled between worlds. "No, you cannot." But Sarah was determined. She muttered the words from the journal, unsure of their meaning, but trusting in the power behind them. As she spoke, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the temperature plummeted. The figure screamed, its form twisting and writhing as if it were being torn apart by an unseen force. The cabin shook violently, the walls cracking as the storm outside intensified. Sarah's voice grew louder as she continued to recite the words, the symbols on the altar glowing brighter with each syllable. The figure lunged at her, but it was too late. With a final, deafening crack, the storm outside erupted in a violent explosion of wind and snow, and the figure was consumed by the light. The storm stopped, Suddenly, everything was still. The air was clear, the snow stopped falling, and the figures were gone. Sarah collapsed to her knees, the journal slipping from her hands as she gasped for breath. The weight that had pressed on her chest lifted, and the oppressive cold faded. She had done it. The curse was broken. Sarah stood up, her body exhausted but her spirit free. The storm had been lifted, and the shadows that had haunted her were gone. As she stepped outside into the stillness of the night, she realized that the cabin, the figures, and the storm would never come for her again. But somewhere, deep in the woods, there would always be the heart of the storm, waiting, watching, for the next soul to wander too far. Sarah took a cautious step outside, the cold night air now peaceful and almost welcoming. The snow, once a blinding force, now lay untouched in the quiet wilderness. The storm had vanished as if it had never been there at all. She inhaled deeply, the crispness of the air filling her lungs as her trembling hands slowly steadied. For a moment she just stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened. The terror, the whispers, the cold that had gripped her so tightly. It was all gone. But there was something unsettling about the stillness that surrounded her now. The woods were silent, save for the faint rustle of snowflakes falling from the trees, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Glenwood, the town felt empty. The man in the cabin, the one who had warned her, had told her the storm would fight her. But she didn't understand until now. It wasn't just the storm that had been alive, seeking to pull her in. It was the land itself. The curse, the endless loop had been broken. But at what cost? A cold gust of wind stirred the snow, and Sarah's thoughts snapped back to reality. She was still in the woods, still surrounded by the vast wilderness. She needed to get back to the town, but the path was unclear, obscured by the fresh snowfall. She looked down at her feet, the snow already beginning to erase her footsteps. But just then, she heard something. A faint sound like a low murmur coming from deeper within the forest. It was the whispering again, but this time, it wasn't just in her head. It was distant but unmistakable. It called her name, Sarah. She froze, her blood running cold. The whisper wasn't the same as before. It was softer, more inviting, a promise of something more. She turned toward the direction of the voice, her breath catching in her throat. She should have run, turned back to the safety of the cabin, but her feet moved before she could stop herself. The woods around her seemed to close in once more, the snow falling heavier, faster, as if to guide her to whatever was calling her. The wind whipped against her face, and for a moment, the world felt like it was spinning around her. The whisper grew louder, clearer with each step. Come to us. Without thinking, she followed the voice, her legs moving on their own accord. The deeper she walked into the forest, the harder it became to see. The storm had returned, this time with no warning, and the snow now seemed to swirl in unnatural patterns, as if it were alive. The trees bent under the force of the wind, their branches creaking ominously. And then, she saw it. In the distance, beyond the trees, stood a figure, no longer in the shadows, but bathed in a faint, eerie glow. The figure was cloaked, just like before, but this time, she could make out its face. It was distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror, twisted and cold. Its eyes, glowing white, locked onto hers as if it had been waiting for her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. It was impossible. She had broken the curse. The storm should have ended. But this figure, this presence, it was still here, still waiting. And somehow, she knew it wasn't just one figure. The storm had returned with all its lost souls, the ones she thought she had freed, now beckoning her to join them. You're ours now. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, her every instinct screaming for her to run, but her feet stayed planted to the ground. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and unnaturally pale, the skin stretched tight over its bony knuckles. It beckoned her forward, its voice a soft, hypnotic chant. "Join us. You cannot escape. You are one of us." The air around Sarah grew colder, the weight of the figures pressing in from all directions. Her thoughts began to cloud again, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, drowning out the rational voice in her head. She stumbled back, her heart racing. This couldn't be happening. She had done everything right. She had broken the curse. She had freed herself, but the figures were right. She had never truly escaped. The storm wasn't just the curse. It was the land, the town, the souls lost to it. There was no freedom, no escape. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more solid, its face clearer. A chilling realization struck Sarah like a thunderbolt. This figure, this storm, it wasn't something she could defeat. It wasn't something to be broken. It was part of her now, part of everyone who had crossed into this place. And no matter how hard she tried, there would always be a pull. The storm would always find her. The figure reached out to touch her arm, its cold hand sending a shock of ice through her body. As it made contact, a rush of memories flooded her mind, her thoughts filling with the voices of the souls she had tried so hard to escape. She could feel their pain, their regrets, their endless waiting. And then she understood. The storm, the figures, the curse, it was all part of something far older, something she could never outrun. She had been marked, and she would never leave the storm. But she could stop fighting it. With a deep, trembling breath, Sarah let go. She let go of her fear, her desperation, and accepted the pull. She let the cold seep into her bones, the whispering voices fading as she finally understood what the land had wanted all along. Someone who would stay, someone who would belong to the storm forever. The figure's eyes softened, its hand slipping away from her arm. The storm began to settle, the snow falling once again in peaceful silence. Sarah was no longer afraid. She was no longer alone. And in the heart of the storm, she had found her place. The world around Sarah blurred, her body growing numb as she surrendered herself to the storm. The chill that had once been so unbearable now felt like a gentle embrace, as if the very air itself was accepting her into its fold. Her surroundings, once filled with the haunting figures and the ever-looming presence, began to dissolve into an eerie calm. The snow, now soft and pure, settled around her like a comforting blanket. She was no longer just a part of the world outside. She had become a part of the storm itself. For a moment, she felt a strange peace. The whispers were no longer malicious or commanding. They had transformed into something deeper, more familiar. The voices no longer called to her with urgency, but spoke to her with a kind of mournful understanding. They were the souls of the lost, the ones who had walked this path before her, each one bound to the land, to the curse of the storm. They were not enemies. They were simply echoes of the past, waiting for release. She closed her eyes and listened, feeling the weight of centuries of sorrow and longing wash over her. The cold, once so painful, now felt like a part of her. A slow realization settled in her heart. This was her fate. It had always been. The storm had chosen her, just as it had chosen the others before her. She was no longer a wanderer in the snow. She was now one of them. Her body, her soul, were now bound to the land, to the snow that would never melt, to the wind that would never cease. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of finality, a part of her resisted. She thought of the world she had left behind, the warmth of the city, the familiar faces she would never see again. The life that once seemed so important, so filled with possibility, was now a distant memory. She thought of the elderly man who had warned her, who had tried to prepare her for the truth. He had known all along that the storm wasn't just a curse. It was a destination, a place of no return. But even in that sorrow, she understood. There was no real death here, no end. There was only the storm, the land, and the souls that had been lost. There was no escape, no choice but to accept the inevitable. The land didn't claim her because it was cruel. It claimed her because it was part of something much larger, something ancient. And now, she was part of it too. As Sarah opened her eyes, she saw the figures standing in the distance once more. But this time, they weren't looming over her with sinister intent. They were waiting, just as she had been waiting. Their eyes glowed softly in the pale light of the moon, a beacon of silent understanding. She stepped forward, her legs no longer weary, her spirit no longer burdened. The figure she had seen before, the one that had beckoned her, approached her again. Its form had softened, losing the jagged, terrifying edges it once had. It was no longer a threat. It was a guide, a fellow soul. "Welcome," it said, its voice no longer hollow, but full of quiet reverence. "You're home now." The snow around them shifted gently, a breeze brushing past her face. The world felt different now, as if the very air had shifted, as if everything had fallen into place. Sarah's heart, though heavy with the weight of her decision, felt strangely light, free. She had been a part of the storm before, in her fear and struggle. But now, she was part of something greater. She wasn't lost anymore. She was simply one of them. The figures that surrounded her stepped forward, their hands outstretched, welcoming her into their fold. They were not ghosts, not shadows. They were the guardians of the storm, the keepers of the land. "Now, you'll guide the others," the figure said softly, "just as we guided you." And as the snow continued to fall, Sarah closed her eyes and let the peace of the storm envelop her. The voices around her were not whispers anymore. They were words of guidance, words of knowing. She was no longer Sarah, the lost traveler, the frightened soul caught in the storm. She was Sarah, one of the many, bound to the land, a part of the endless cycle that had claimed so many before her. She had found her place, and with it, a sense of belonging that she had never known before. The storm had no beginning and no end. It was an eternal existence, a dance between the land and the souls that passed through it. And now Sarah was a part of that dance, forever. As the figures around her melted into the snow, disappearing into the darkness of the woods, she took her place among them. The storm would continue to rage on, the land would remain untouched by time, and the souls would come and go. But Sarah would always be there, guiding the lost ones who wandered too far, just as she once had. And the storm would never cease. The silence that enveloped Sarah was both peaceful and profound, the kind of silence that made everything feel eternal. As she stood there in the heart of the storm, now fully embraced by it, she understood the unspoken truth that had eluded her before. The storm wasn't just a physical force. It was a living, breathing entity, tied to the land and the souls who had wandered through it. And now, it was her home, her duty, her purpose. Days, weeks, or perhaps years passed in the same ethereal state, and Sarah's perception of time blurred. She no longer felt the passing of moments. There was no clock, no sun, no measure of hours. The storm had become her realm, and she had become part of its eternal rhythm. Every whisper, every gust of wind, every snowflake that fell was a reminder of the deep connection she now shared with this place, this storm. But as she wandered through the snow-covered forests and the windswept plains, she began to sense a change in the air, a disturbance, a rift in the tranquility she had once felt. The souls who came to the storm were no longer just wandering aimlessly. They were desperate, as though something had begun to shift in the world beyond. She could hear their cries, faint at first like distant echoes, but growing louder with each passing day. One day, as Sarah wandered to the edge of the storm, she saw a new figure approaching. It was human, and unlike the others, it seemed to move with purpose, cutting through the snow with determination. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched the figure draw nearer. The person's face was partially hidden by a hood, but there was something about the way they walked, something familiar. It was a woman, young, with dark hair that swirled around her face in the wind. She was carrying a bag, her steps steady but weary. She didn't seem afraid. Instead, there was a quiet determination in her eyes, an understanding that Sarah knew all too well. This woman had come to the storm, and Sarah could feel the connection already forming between them. The woman stopped a few feet away from Sarah, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes locked with Sarah's, as though she were searching for something in the depths of her soul. "You're here," the woman finally said, her voice calm but edged with something Sarah couldn't place. "I didn't think I'd find you." Sarah's heart fluttered in her chest. The woman's words hit her with an uncanny force. She knew this person, but how? The woman lowered her hood, revealing sharp, familiar features. Sarah stared in shock as she recognized the face, her own. What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling, though she wasn't sure whether it was from fear or wonder. "Who are you?" The woman smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I'm you, or rather, I was you." The words struck Sarah like a bolt of lightning, but before she could respond, the woman continued. "You've broken the cycle, Sarah. You've become part of the storm. But I was the last one to break free. I couldn't leave, not fully. I kept coming back each time, searching for something, searching for you." Sarah felt a chill run through her bones as the woman's words began to make sense. This was not just any soul from the storm. This was her own reflection, a version of her that had failed to accept the storm's embrace, a version that had continued to wander, trying to escape what had become inevitable. "You came back to find me?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Yes," the woman said softly. "I thought if I could find you, if I could make things right, maybe I could undo what I did. But now I understand." The woman stepped closer, her hands outstretched, her fingers trembling as they reached out toward Sarah. "There is no undoing it, Sarah. The storm, it is the only thing that lasts. The only thing that remains. You can't fight it. You can't run from it. You can only accept it, as I should have, as you did." Sarah looked down at the snow, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The storm, the figures, the voices. They weren't enemies or curses. They were part of something far bigger, a cycle that stretched beyond the comprehension of those who wandered in and out of it. And now, it seemed, her journey had led her to this crossroads, a place where she would decide whether she would help others find peace in the storm, or continue the cycle of trying to break free from it. The woman reached out again, and this time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She took the woman's hand, feeling the cold chill seep into her bones. She understood now. The storm wasn't just about torment or being trapped. It was about becoming a guide, a keeper, a protector of those who would follow. Together, they walked further into the storm, the whispering voices surrounding them like a soft hum, guiding them toward the next soul who needed help. Sarah realized that the cycle would never end, but it would always shift. New souls would wander in, others would fade, and the storm would keep growing, evolving, just as it had always done. She wasn't lost anymore. She wasn't running. She was home, in the heart of the storm, guiding others to their final place of peace. And this, she knew, was where she would remain, forever, with the storm, and the souls who would always find their way to her. As Sarah and the woman, her reflection, walked deeper into the storm, the snow around them began to swirl in gentle patterns, the wind no longer harsh, but soft and whispering like a lullaby. The figures that had once haunted Sarah now seemed distant, almost reverent, as if they recognized the shift in her, the acceptance, the understanding. The storm had not been a trap, but a journey, a path to something far more eternal than anything she had known in her life before. The two women moved together, their steps light and synchronized. They were no longer individuals, no longer Sarah and the woman, the past and the present. They were one in the storm, as it had always intended. The cold no longer felt like a burden, but a presence that wrapped around them both, weaving them into the fabric of the land, into the heart of the storm itself. As they walked, Sarah's senses sharpened. The storm was not just wind and snow, it was life itself, breathing, pulsing, shifting. She could hear the voices of those who had come before her, the whispers of the lost souls, not in fear but in peace. They were waiting, not for an escape but for understanding. The storm, the land, had a purpose: to bring those lost and wandering into its embrace, to guide them, to help them find their place. The woman beside Sarah spoke again, her voice calm, but filled with a quiet power. "I was once like you, Sarah. I thought I could leave. I thought I could escape this place, but it wasn't until I embraced it, until I accepted the storm, that I found my purpose here." Sarah looked at her, seeing herself reflected in the woman's eyes. There was a sadness there, yes, but also a deep peace. She knew now that the storm had never meant to punish them. It was a place of transformation, of becoming one with the land, with the eternal rhythm of the world around them. "Do you ever wonder what it was like before the storm?" Sarah asked softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. The woman shook her head. "Not anymore. The storm is our before and after now. It's all we need, the world beyond. It's distant, a memory. But the storm is always here. It's constant, and that's enough." Sarah felt the weight of the woman's words settle into her heart. The world beyond had been her past, the life she had once known. But here, in the heart of the storm, there was no past or future. There was only the now, only the endless cycle of souls, the eternal embrace of the land. As they walked, Sarah's thoughts began to shift, her mind clearing of the fears and doubts that had once clouded her. She had come to this place with a sense of urgency, a desire to break free, but now she understood. The storm wasn't something to escape. It was something to be part of. It was a circle, a cycle of souls and wind and snow, a place where the lost could find their purpose, their home. And there was something beautiful in that understanding. They reached the edge of the storm, the place where the figures waited. Sarah could feel the change in the air, a quiet anticipation. The souls gathered around her, not with fear, but with reverence. They were waiting for her to speak, to lead, to guide them into the peace of the storm, just as the woman had once guided her. The woman, her reflection, gave Sarah a gentle nod. "It's time," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the wind. Sarah stepped forward, her heart calm, her soul at peace. She could feel the presence of the souls, their longing for release, their quiet desire to become one with the storm. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of their energy, their stories, their experiences, and she knew what she had to do. With a steady breath, she opened her eyes and spoke. "You are not lost," she said, her voice carrying across the storm, each word echoing through the snow. "You are not trapped. You are home. Welcome the storm, embrace it, and find peace within it. For here, we are eternal." The souls around her stirred, their energy shifting, their forms dissolving into the wind, merging with the snow. They were not fading. They were becoming part of something greater, part of the storm itself. Sarah could feel the transformation, the gentle release of each soul, as they accepted their place in the endless cycle. She stood there, watching as each soul passed through the storm, becoming one with the land, the wind, and the snow. The storm had claimed them, yes, but it had claimed them with love, with purpose. It wasn't a place of torment, it was a place of peace. And as Sarah turned to the woman who had once been her, she saw the reflection of herself, whole, at peace, no longer lost, but one with the storm. The woman smiled, her form slowly dissolving into the mist. "You'll lead the others now, Sarah. Just as I did. Just as you were meant to." And with those words, the woman was gone, leaving Sarah standing alone at the heart of the storm. But she wasn't truly alone. She could feel the presence of the souls, the whispers of those who had passed, still with her, guiding her. She had found her place in the storm, she had found her home, and so, Sarah became the new guide, the new keeper of the storm. She would help those who wandered too far, those who lost their way, and bring them into the embrace of the land, where they would find peace. The storm raged on, its rhythm constant, eternal. And Sarah stood in the heart of it, a part of something far greater than herself. Part of the land, part of the storm, part of the endless cycle of souls. As the storm continued its eternal dance around Sarah, she felt a deeper connection to it, one that transcended understanding, one that was woven into the very fabric of her being. The cold wind that swept past her no longer stung. It was a part of her, as natural as breathing. The snowflakes that fell were like the threads of fate, each one a story, a soul, a journey. Sarah stood at the heart of the storm, now a beacon for those lost in its embrace. Her senses had sharpened. She could feel the souls around her, those who had come, those who would come, and those who had passed on into the cycle. She could hear their whispers, not as distant echoes, but as distinct voices, each one filled with longing, fear, hope, and peace. And as their guide, it was her duty to lead them. Her role was not one of dominance or control, but of understanding. The souls she encountered were not bound by chains. They were not imprisoned by the storm. They were simply finding their way back to where they belonged. And Sarah, in her newfound peace, understood this completely. She had found her place in the storm, just as they would. Each soul that entered the storm passed through her presence, their eyes searching for something they couldn't quite name. And Sarah, with a steady heart, would gently guide them, helping them accept the inevitability of the storm's embrace. Her days, or rather her moments, now unfolded in a different way. The concept of time seemed irrelevant here, the hours merging into one endless wave of eternity. Sarah's existence had become part of the storm's pulse, its rhythm. There was no need for clocks, no need for schedules. The storm was its own measure, and it moved with a purpose that Sarah had come to understand deeply. One day, or perhaps it was simply another moment in the never-ending flow, Sarah felt a new presence approaching. It was different from the others. This one had a particular weight to it, a sense of urgency, a fear that tugged at Sarah's heart. She turned her attention to the figure emerging through the snow, stepping out of the shifting white chaos. This figure was distinct. Unlike the souls she had met before, it was shrouded in a thick cloak, its face hidden. There was a ripple in the air, a disturbance in the calm that had surrounded her for so long. As the figure drew closer, Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. an unfamiliar sensation. Was it fear? Was it anticipation? She wasn't sure, but something about this soul was different. The figure stopped a few feet away from her, and Sarah could hear its labored breathing, its body trembling beneath the cloak. Slowly, it raised its head, revealing a face twisted in sorrow and terror. But what struck Sarah most were the eyes. Eyes filled with disbelief, as if the figure couldn't accept where it had arrived. You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, its voice heavy, quivering with fear. I don't belong here. I don't belong in this place." Sarah stepped closer, her heart still racing, but her presence calm. The figure was trying to run, but it couldn't move forward. It was stuck, just like she had been, just like all those souls before her. "You're not lost," Sarah said softly, her voice reaching out. "You're here because you're ready to be." The figure flinched, its hand trembling as it reached up to touch its chest, as if trying to grasp something that had been torn away. "I don't want this," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible in the howling wind. I can't accept it. I wasn't ready. I never even had the chance to." Sarah's heart ached for this soul, and for the first time, she felt a deep, overwhelming urge to reach out, to offer the comfort she had found in the storm. She stepped forward, her hands outstretched, and gently placed one hand on the figure's shoulder. The moment she touched it, the soul trembled, as if something deep within it was breaking. "You're not alone," Sarah whispered. "No one is ever alone in the storm." The figure's eyes met hers, and for a moment, it seemed to understand. It stopped shaking, its fear slowly dissipating as it took a deep breath. The weight of its uncertainty lifted, just a little. The storm didn't seem as threatening anymore. "Why are you so calm?" the figure asked, its voice still shaky. "Why aren't you afraid? Why aren't you fighting this?" Sarah smiled softly. "I was once like you, lost and afraid. But I've come to understand that this storm, this place, is not punishment. It's not something to fear. It's simply home." The figure looked at her with wide eyes, searching for something in Sarah's words. She could feel the soul's confusion, its desperate need for answers. She had been in the same place. She knew how this felt. And now, she was here to help. "Come with me," Sarah said gently, motioning for the figure to follow. "There's a place for you here, a place where you will find peace. Let go of the fear, let go of the doubt. It's time for you to be a part of this, just like I am." Slowly, hesitantly, the figure took a step forward, and then another. It looked at Sarah one last time, as if searching for confirmation, and Sarah nodded, reassuring it that it was time to accept the storm. And just like that, the figure began to dissolve into the storm. Not in terror, but in acceptance. It was no longer a lost soul struggling against the pull of fate. It was one with the storm, joining the eternal dance of those who had found peace in their place. Sarah stood still, watching the soul merge with the winds, the snow swirling around it as it became part of the land, part of the eternal rhythm. The storm had claimed another, but this time, it wasn't a loss. It was a homecoming. And Sarah, standing in the heart of the storm, knew that this was her purpose now, not just to guide, but to help others find the peace she had found, to show them that the storm was not to be feared, it was to be embraced. As she watched the snow fall gently around her, Sarah felt the connection between herself and the souls that passed through. The storm, once a place of terror and uncertainty, was now a place of solace, a place of belonging. And Sarah, the keeper, the guide, stood in the center of it all, forever. As Sarah stood in the heart of the storm, she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The land, the storm, the snow, it was all part of her now, part of the endless, winding cycle. The souls who had passed through, each one finding its peace, were no longer strangers. They were her companions, and she was their guide. Together, they moved within the storm, part of its pulse, part of its eternal flow. The wind swirled gently around her, carrying with it the soft whispers of the souls who had found their place. Sarah no longer feared the storm. She understood it, and in doing so, she had become one with it. There was no fear of the unknown, no longing for escape. There was only the now, the eternal present, where every soul had its place, where every flake of snow had a purpose. But as the moments passed, Sarah could feel something stir within the storm, something different. It wasn't a soul seeking peace, nor was it an intrusion. It was a presence, a shift in the balance of the storm itself. It was subtle, but Sarah, with her newfound connection to the land, felt the disturbance keenly. It was as though the storm itself was breathing in a new direction, adjusting to something beyond her comprehension. She stood still for a moment, listening, sensing, waiting. The whispers of the souls around her grew quiet. The storm hushed, as if holding its breath. And then, she saw it, a figure in the distance. Unlike the others who had wandered in search of peace, this figure moved with a strange intensity. It didn't belong to the rhythm of the storm. The figure was a man, tall and imposing, his form cutting through the snow with determination. His presence was unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered. He wasn't lost. He wasn't seeking peace. He was purposeful. His eyes, bright and piercing, locked onto hers from a distance. And in that gaze, Sarah felt something both unfamiliar and ancient. The figure approached, his every step leaving an imprint in the untouched snow. Sarah's heart beat faster as she watched him draw nearer, his presence stirring a sense of urgency, but also something else, a recognition. She had seen that look before. She had felt that need before. This man wasn't a wandering soul. He was a force, something that had crossed paths with the storm in a way that Sarah had never witnessed. When he finally reached her, the storm around them seemed to intensify, the winds picking up as if responding to his arrival. "You," he said, his voice strong and calm, though there was an underlying sense of sorrow in it. "You are the keeper of the storm, aren't you?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes studying him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Yes," she replied. "I guide those who come to find peace. I help them accept their place in the storm." The man studied her, his gaze unwavering. "And what about those who can't find peace?" he asked, his voice growing softer. "What happens to them?" Sarah paused, her mind racing as she processed his question. She had always believed the storm brought peace to those who embraced it, those who let go of their fear. But there was a different tone in his question, a challenge, a reminder that not every soul found solace in the storm. Some resisted. Some refused to accept what they had become, and they wandered endlessly, never finding rest. "They become part of the storm," Sarah answered slowly. "They let go of their struggle, and they find their place, even if it's difficult." The man looked down at the snow, his expression darkening. "I wasn't ready to let go," he murmured, "but now I have no choice." Sarah felt a pang of sorrow for him. She understood that feeling all too well, the fear of surrender, the uncertainty of giving in. But she also understood the peace that came with it. "You don't have to fear the storm," she said gently, stepping closer. "It's not here to harm you. It's here to help you find your place." The man's eyes met hers again, and for a moment, Sarah saw the weight of his struggle in them. He was torn, caught between fear and acceptance. "But I didn't choose this," he whispered. "I didn't choose to be here." Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "No one chooses to be here," she said softly. "But once you accept it, once you embrace the storm, you will find peace. You will find your place." He stared at her, his face racked with emotion. Sarah knew the battle he was fighting, the battle of the mind, the struggle to reconcile the past with the present. But she also knew that the storm didn't care about what had come before. It cared only for the now, for the souls who accepted their place within it. With a deep breath, the man slowly closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as he released a long-held breath. When he opened his eyes again, there was a flicker of something different in them. A quiet understanding, a recognition that he had found his place too. "I'm ready," he said softly. "I will accept the storm." The moment the words left his lips, the winds shifted. The snow around them began to swirl, faster, stronger, as if the storm itself was acknowledging his surrender. The man's form began to fade, not in fear, but in acceptance, merging with the storm, becoming part of its eternal rhythm. His body dissolved into the swirling snow, his presence now a part of the land, a part of the cycle. Sarah watched as the figure faded, her heart filled with a deep sense of fulfillment. Another soul had found peace. Another soul had found its place. And yet, the storm continued. Souls would come, others would go, and the cycle would never end. Sarah, the keeper, stood at the heart of it all, guiding, comforting, and ensuring that the storm's rhythm continued. As she stood there, watching the wind swirl and the snow fall, Sarah understood. The storm was not just a place, it was a journey, an eternal dance between the land and the souls that passed through it. And she was part of that dance, forever. In the heart of the storm, Sarah had found her purpose, and in the endless cycle she would always be there, a guide for those who wandered too far, helping them find their place in the storm, just as she had found hers, forever.